In 1960, a 23-year-old woman spent her days in a cacophony of metal and dust, tending to a high-speed cotton loom. 3 years later, she was strapped into a Vostok rocket, the roar of the factory replaced by the thunder of a liquid-fueled engine. Usually, the path to the stars followed a rigid military ladder. Only elite test pilots with thousands of flight hours were considered for the Cosmonaut Corps. Yet this textile worker managed to bypass the entire military aviation hierarchy. In 1961, the success of Yuri Gagarin had already shaken the West, but a new pressure was mounting within the Soviet space program. Intelligence reports indicated the Americans were secretly screening female pilots for a program that would eventually be known as the Mercury 13. The head of Soviet cosmonaut training viewed a potential American female flight as a direct threat to Soviet prestige. To secure a definitive propaganda lead in the Cold War, the USSR issued an urgent directive. They had to launch a woman first. This political mandate rewrote the recruitment manual. To maximize the symbol of Soviet progress, the program looked past the cockpits of fighter jets and turned toward the civilian factories. Early Vostok engineering had a glaring limitation: no soft landing system. The multi-ton capsule couldn't slow down, meaning touchdown was fatal. Survival required the pilot to manually trigger an ejection seat 4 miles up, leaving the metal sphere behind to parachute to the ground. In this specific engineering environment, traditional flight hours were secondary. The success of the mission and the pilot's life depended almost entirely on extreme high-altitude parachuting experience. This made Valentina Tereshkova an ideal candidate. While her co-workers at the mill knew her as a quiet textile worker, she spent her weekends as a competitive skydiver, logging dozens of jumps at her local aero club. Tereshkova's mastery of the parachute allowed her to bridge the mechanical flaws of the Vostok, while her status as an ordinary worker provided the political narrative the Kremlin demanded. The selection process began with 400 candidates, but the screening was ruthless. They were filtered through a battery of medical and psychological tests until only 5 women remained. Premier Nikita Khrushchev took a personal interest in Tereshkova. Her father had died commanding a tank in the Winter War, making her the perfect symbol of the Soviet working class and its sacrifices. The transition was immediate and total. The women were stripped of civilian status and commissioned as privates in the Soviet Air Forces to begin their formal training. The training pushed their bodies to the edge of failure. They were locked in isolation cells for days, placed in decompression chambers to simulate the vacuum, and strapped into centrifuges that crushed their lungs under extreme G-forces. They also practiced emergency water landings in the ocean, jumping into agitated waves in heavy gear to ensure they could survive if the capsule drifted off course during re-entry. This compressed military regimen successfully turned a civilian textile worker into an elite Air Force officer, prepared for the most dangerous journey of the 20th century. On June 16, 1963, Tereshkova was sealed inside Vostok 6. At 26 years old, she remains the youngest woman to ever attempt a mission into Earth's orbit. Using the call sign Chaika, or Seagull, she watched the Earth drop away. Her first transmission described a sky-blue horizon with a dark strip, a view no woman had ever seen before. Over the next 3 days, Tereshkova orbited the Earth 48 times. By the time she finished her mission, she had logged more flight time than every American astronaut who had flown before her combined. The mission was physically grueling. She endured constant nausea and physical discomfort, yet she never stopped recording data in her flight logs or capturing photographs of the atmosphere. The return was as perilous as predicted. Tereshkova ejected from the capsule at 20,000 feet, fighting violent wind gusts that threatened to tangle her parachute lines as she plummeted toward the Kazakh steppe. She hit the ground hard, receiving a bruise on her face, but she landed safely. The gamble on her amateur parachuting skills had finally paid off. Tereshkova was greeted as a national hero. Awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, she stood atop Lenin's tomb as parades of millions celebrated her return in Red Square. The Soviet state quickly repurposed her as a global diplomat. She toured 42 countries over the next 7 years, meeting world leaders and speaking to thousands as a representative of Soviet achievement. But her status as a global icon came at a cost. Fearful of the political damage if a national treasure were killed in an accident, the space program permanently barred her from flying again. The female cosmonaut program was disbanded entirely in 1969. Tereshkova was moved into a lifelong political career, serving for decades in the Soviet Parliament and later the Russian State Duma. Valentina Tereshkova was recruited to be the perfect pawn in a Cold War propaganda game, but her survival and her legacy were earned through the unbreakable grit of a woman who was willing to jump into the unknown.